Mesdames et messieurs, une chaleureuse main d'applaudissements pour accueillir Manuel Lima, mesdames et messieurs. Merci.
Bonjour Montréal. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'être ici avec vous pour parler de cognitive design. I'm switching back to English because my French is a little bit rusty. But it's truly an honor and a pleasure, and thanks so much for the invite. Thanks for the brilliant introduction, Luke, which I understood most of it. So, in an audience of designers and researchers, if designers had a superpower, I really think the superpower would be empathy. Empathy, right? It's a really important superpower for most designers. And what do I mean by empathy? Empathy meaning the ability to read the user's minds, right? To really understand what's going through their head. And of course, you can argue that empathy, you can actually cultivate empathy in different ways. And this is could be part of your own personal growth, right? Your own sort of personal journey. These are things that if you do, not only do you get to be a better designer, but also a better human being, a better partner, a better parent, a better friend, and so on. Things like practicing active listening, right? It's really important to be present, be in the moment, no judgment, sustain self-interest when you're actually genuinely listening to someone's pains or someone's struggle, right? Also get to know yourself. It's a great tool to actually build empathy, right? Understanding your own gaps, your own biases, your own constraints, right? Really do some introspection, do some self-analysis, and be mindful about your own limitations. Also, challenge yourself. This is actually very close to my heart. I find that this is what kind of drives my life, my career, my recent parenthood, is really stepping out of your comfort zone, right? So I think there's many aspects that you can find that induce empathy. But one of the most empathy-inducing experiences for me is traveling. Traveling is great for you to connect with fellow human beings that are different in many other ways, from society to culture to language, but yet we all share a tremendous amount of similarities. And then finally, cultivate curiosity. That's also very close to me. Be invested, be engaged in others, right? And their unique circumstances. Everyone has an interesting story to tell, right? So again, these are things that every designer can go through and will make you better as a human being. But cultivating empathy can be challenging as part of a personal growth. In many ways, there's different tools that can help designers achieve this equally, if not even better. One tool that I'm sure Mina will talk extensively about is user research, right? And all of you are probably in the audience have witnessed user research. Maybe many of you have been involved in user research, which I hope you have. And there are countless of techniques pertaining to qualitative research. And again, I'm sure the next speaker will go into this in detail. These are just some of them that I think are somehow the more basic, but also arguably the most useful ones, right? From surveys, arguably the cheapest and fastest way to actually get a sense of the pulse of your audience, to actually interviews. Sometimes you actually need to sit down and talk one-on-one or in a group setting with your users, get to know them on a personal level, get to know their pains and their struggles. Sometimes you actually want to get out of your office and actually venture out into a field study, right? Get to know your users in their natural habitat, right? In their natural context. And that also provides a huge amount of insight and knowledge. And of course, finally, building a set of personas, a set of user segments that can dramatically improve your empathy, your connection to your fellow users, your target audience, and actually understand what they are going through. And then you can start thinking about specific features for your product, specific sort of enhancements to the experience you are designing through in thinking about personas. Like, what would Alice do? What would a given persona do in this particular scenario, in this particular journey, right? In this particular task. So these are really super strong tools coming from user research that help immensely designers build a sense of empathy for their own target audience. But the area that I really want to focus on today, arguably because it's one of the less known, or at least an area that's rarely taught in design schools or in design books. It's really about cognitive design, right? It's really about us designers understanding universal cognitive behaviors through well-established principles, biases, and heuristics. So I'm going to talk to you about many of these principles today, a few of them, at least the ones that I consider to be more relevant. And I'm going to divide them in two different sections. One is really about displaying, right? Principles of design towards presenting and styling information. And the second part is going to be about organizing information. How do we prioritize the right information, and how do we structure the right information in a way that makes sense to our users? So let's start with display. Even though this idea, the idea that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, this idea has been with us for many centuries, in fact. It goes all the way back to Aristotle, who was the first one to conceive this type of concept, back in the 4th century BC. But it was really in the early 20th century, through the work of the Berlin School of Experimental Psychology, that this idea really became ingrained in our minds, to a point that now all of us, designers and non-designers alike, can recognize the importance of this statement in what later became known as Gestalt psychology, right? And this is, again, the fact that I am a designer who went through an undergrad and a graduate degree without ever studying Gestalt psychology is a testament to the failure of the design system, educational system, to that point. So what is Gestalt psychology, right? Gestalt really proved that the operational principle of the brain is ultimately holistic, or in other words, is irreducible. And one of the famous experiments of the Gestalt school was called the Gestalt effect. And it showed us that the recognition of shapes and forms are not based on the collection of elements, dots and lines, but on seeing them as a fully identifiable pattern. And this is a very famous image used to prove this point, where most humans are able, I mean most because some are actually still not able to do it, recognize a dog, a Dalmatian dog in the picture, right? But many machines still today fail to understand it. And the reason why is that, again, our human brain is holistic. We see things as a whole. We don't see the individual dots and try to make connections between them, right? So it's a really important thing that Gestalt proved. And Gestalt also provided us with a series of really important foundational design principles. The law of similarity is one of them. So what is the law of similarity? The law of similarity tells us that elements that are similar are perceived to be more related than elements that are dissimilar, right? So immediately you look at those three columns, right, and you can see this duality between small and large circles, blue and gray circles, and circles and triangles on the third one, right? You immediately group those into two separate categories, even though they are grouped together. And how does this actually apply to UI, user interfaces and user experiences? In many different ways. This is an example of something I was part of a few years back. We were building this educational tool, and part of this, we had to create this idea of notion of progress, right? That you would come back to the product. This was actually working for codeacademy.com, a tool that allows people to learn how to code online. And then here, you notice how green is used as a single accent color to indicate progress throughout the experience. Whatever page or section the user is, they see green, it's an indication of progress, so they know they have to continue their own journey of learning to code. There's, of course, many other ways to apply the law of similarity. One is connecting content and categories through color. So in this case, a given category has a given color, and then throughout, let's say, a feed of content, you associate the color with that given category, right? The law of similarity. Or even in a more obvious experience here that groups similar items and makes it easier for customers to actually browse by putting all related items in one single row. So the law of similarity is immensely important for design. The second one, again, still coming from Gestalt, is the law of proximity, right? And the law of proximity says that elements that are close together are perceived to be more related than elements that are further apart. So immediately here, you don't actually recognize even though you do recognize, of course, triangles and circles, you actually see 5 distinct groups. Because again, proximity becomes a more important distinction. And of course, there's different ways to apply this to UI in the good and bad practices. Here you can see the 2 buttons on the bottom. Just because they are close together, you perceive them to be related. Of course, the symbols inside the buttons also are another visual affordance to that effect, but it works primarily due to the law of proximity, right? If they were completely further apart, you wouldn't associate that to be single controls over the same type of spectrum. But of course, the law of proximity can be applied pretty badly as well. So this is a critical example. I remember opening Concur. Concur is a tool that many enterprises uses. I don't know if Deloitte uses Concur, but I think every major company uses it. It's one of the worst experiences ever. I hope there's no Concur user experience designers. Or maybe there's an opportunity for improvement. So I remember like opening this for the first time, filling all the expense details and whatnot, and then looking for the button, like what do I press next or submit? And I couldn't find the button. The button, as you notice, is actually right there on the bottom right corner. Completely missed that. Or even this real-life example of what not to do. This should be in design schools like everywhere, right? It's in design books. It's like, this is a really great application of the law of proximity. And you notice that they try to use the same color, but even the same color doesn't work. Because again, the law of proximity surpasses all other graphical variances. And another one, again, still coming from the Gestalt school, is known as the uniform connectedness. This is a really important one, and it can actually explain why designers love boxes so much, right? Now you will understand. This is the great reveal, why designers love boxes. Elements that are connected by uniform visual properties are perceived to be more related than elements that are not connected. This has been applied to user interfaces for decades now. And it's pretty simple how it works, actually. It's really, really effective and so simple. So, example on the left, you see immediately, again, law of proximity. You don't even think about the shapes necessarily or colors. You just see 2 individual columns, right? But on an example of the B, notice how what I did was just draw boxes around them. And that's enough for you now to see that as 3 boxes instead of 2 columns, as example on the left. So it's a really simple tweak. And of course, as you can imagine, designers do this all the time in many of the interfaces that we know today, right? So notice on the bottom left here, there's a box, an horizontal row of very different articles. You couldn't find more distinct articles, right? From a bookshelf to sunglasses, a camera. Yet, you perceive them to be similar because they are actually in the same row, in the same box. Of course, the title also helps, so there's other visual affordances that you can play with. Or even the example on the right, which is, again, in one single card or box, it gathers all these metadata about a specific property in this website. So leaving Gestalt for a little bit, there's other really interesting design principles and biases that can really explain the success of a given experience. One of my favorites is called oro vacui in Latin. And oro vacui is a tendency that all of us, it's shared across all humans. It's a tendency to favor filling blank spaces with objects and elements over leaving them blank or empty. I think we all know what that means. Whenever you buy a new bookshelf, right, it's just a matter of time before it gets filled with stuff that you don't even know you need to have at your home. But now, even though that's a very prevalent sort of bias, what's interesting about oro vacui is that as oro vacui increases, as our tendency to fill empty spaces with stuff increases, the perceived value and prestige tends to decrease, right? So think about the example of, let's say, Chinatown. When you go to Chinatown in New York, where I'm based, you see the window shop, right? It's filled with stuff. What is the immediate perception you have? Cheap stuff, right? Not very sort of expensive. In the opposite side, if you go to Fifth Avenue, right? Not too far, you have maybe 1 or 2, 3 items in the window, right? What's your perception? It's the inverse, right? Highly expensive, very prestige. And the same thing applies to UI, right? This is an image of Yahoo a few years back. And again, it's taking Vacui to heart, right? It's really trying to fill that space with as much information as possible, not physical stuff, but information. And then, of course, Google. I promise this is the only slide that I have of Google. It is definitely a good example in this particular principle. But again, look at the difference, right? Here you have really low Vacui, right? But then again, the perception that you have is that this is a much more modern, more sophisticated, more valuable experience altogether. Again, because it's not trying to like cram everything it can on that single window. So Vacui, really important one. The last one in the series of displaying information is the Aesthetic-Usability Effect. And this one is very close to my heart, as it should be to any designer. So any designer that has ever been criticized or felt offended by the words beautifying something, or why don't you make it a bit prettier, right? They should really know this slide, this principle to heart. So Aesthetic-Usability Effect, this has actually been proved by years of empirical research on this area, is that aesthetic designs, aesthetic products, are perceived to be easier to use than less aesthetic designs. Perception matters a great deal, even if they are not, but they are perceived as such, right? I mean, it's the same bias that exists for people. You know, we tend to perceive beautiful people sometimes as more competent, sometimes as more valuable in some ways. And the more interesting thing for me is that not only we perceive them to be easier to use, but we are also more forgiving when interacting with a beautiful product, right? If it crashes on you, if there's a bug that runs on your app, whatever happens, you tend to be more forgiving if that specific app, product, or experience is a beautiful, well-crafted one. So think about this. And again, I tell this a lot of times to engineering teams when they're actually like going through endless bugs, how a beautiful experience actually is able to change the perception, change the experience altogether from a user standpoint. And of course, many companies and many industries have adapted this principle to a great degree. Think about countless industries and segments that you can think where a given player has differentiated themselves by really embracing this aesthetic principle, right? By betting on beauty as a key differentiator. As Donald Norman said once, attractive things work better, right? So let's change gears a little bit, still in the realm of cognitive design, learning some of these principles and biases, but now looking a little bit more attentively at how we actually prioritize and structure information in a relevant way. One of the most important principles for any UX designer should be the 80-20 rule, right? So 80-20 rule is actually a very famous rule. It was actually original from the field of economics. It's also known as the Pareto's principle due to the Italian economist. And it basically says that a high percentage of effects in any large system are caused by a low percentage of variables, right? And this can be applied to many different areas outside of UX. 80% of a company's revenue comes from roughly 20% of its products. 80% of a town's traffic is on 20% of its roads. And it goes on and on and on. There's a long list of how this is actually applied to multiple industries. Now, how does it actually apply to UX, or user interface? In the following way. Roughly 80% of a product's usage involves 20% of its features. So think about this, 20% of the features. So what's critical for designers is really to identify that 20% and focus on those 20%. You can see, again, a few examples. This is from Gmail. And notice how, again, the 20% features are really focused by both size and color, right? And even placement to a certain degree, right? So what are the primary actions you can do here? You can hit the compose button, or you can search for an older message. The other type of features and functionalities are hidden under either on the more button, on the settings. That's where we hide a lot of those long tail features that a much lesser percentage of users actually interact with. And of course, when you think about mobile, you can see this straight away. You know, the infamous burger menu has been so successful because it kind of works like the dusty rug, right? Where we just put everything inside. It's the new kitchen sink approach, right? But to a certain degree, it's not actually, when used well, it's not a bad practice because again, it helps users focus on that 20%. Normally in many apps, that 20% is featured on the top, on the bottom of the main homepage, right? Those are maybe the 4 key features, the key functionalities that a large percentage, could be 80%, 85% users actually interact with. The second principle is called Hick's law, another great one. Hick's law is really also known as the paradox of choice. There's actually a great book by the same name, The Paradox of Choice, which I'll encourage everyone to read. But Hick's law says the following: the time it takes to make a decision increases as the number of alternatives increase, right? And it's kind of funny. I think this principle does not, of course, only apply to UX and UI. I think this is really a conundrum of modern times, right? I feel all of us in modern societies like to think that we have a lot of freedom, that we have so many options, so many things to choose, but we forget that many of those options actually create anxiety, right? And anxiety happens even when you go to the supermarket, right? And you try to get some mustard. And then you have like 20 different types of mustard. I just want mustard, you know? I just want ketchup. Like, I don't want all these flavors and options. I just get anxious from every single purchase that I have to make, which is, of course, a problem. And every time I think about this, I think about this passage by Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, who says that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. It's one of the most beautiful, well-put statements about this specific conundrum of modern times. And this is actually practice that we at Google use all the time when conceiving digital experiences, when conceiving products, right? When everything is important, nothing is important, right? And this happens all the time as designers because maybe you are working with a team of PMs and engineers or different teams, and every team thinks that feature is the most important thing that should be on a given product or environment. And then you have to make that debate, you have to make that decision. When everyone is fighting, when everyone is screaming out loud to you, right? It goes back to our Vacui. You're just overwhelmed with information. And of course, there's many bad experiences. This is not even close to many of them that I could feel, but like notice the amount of tabs on this left side, the really long form. That's a really problem, sort of common practice of having these really long forms, and immediately I think it's really anxiety inducing. As you open that long form, you become just so frustrated and anxious. So it's definitely something that we need to pay attention to. Now, this one could actually solve many of these issues. It's called progressive disclosure. It's a really important interaction design practice and tool. And progressive disclosure is really a strategy for managing information complexity in which only necessary or requested information is displayed at any given time. Think about when you are using any sort of map online tool, right? You start off with the world. The world only shows country boundaries, right? As you progressively zoom in, more information is displayed. Now you have I-roads, now you have highways, now you have secondary roads, tertiary roads, etc., places. All of that is displayed, not all at once, otherwise you'll be running away immediately. It's progressively disclosed to the user, right, in a way that makes sense. And one way is to actually chunk up a questionnaire into different segments, to different sections, and then progressively disclose them to your audience. Gaming, by the way, games are a great example. They really explore progressive disclosure quite a lot. And they are keen on keeping users motivated and disclosing content slowly, right? Let's say that you are learning French in one of these tools. It would be impossible to learn all of it at once, right? So they have to start slowly, progressively, for you to master that new skill that you have, right? Again, progressive disclosure, critical way for memorizing information. And I always go back to this, which is actually in my second sort of area of practice, which is information visualization. This is a very known, called the information visualization mantra, which is overview first, zoom in filter, details on demand. Even though this applies to information design and data visualization, you can actually apply it to UX and UI as well. Next, we have the serial position effects. This one is really interesting and has been actually practiced even before there were digital experiences to a great degree. It basically says that any given list, the items that you memorize more effectively are the ones on the beginning of that list and in the end of that list, regardless of what that list is. And that list, by the way, could be either vertical or horizontal, right? So the first ones, because you tend to pay a lot more attention to the beginning of a story, to the beginning of a list. And then the last ones based on recency, because they were probably the last ones that you read or consumed. So you can apply this to endless ways when it comes to UI. Not even UI. On the left side, you have restaurant menus. They have been applying this for ages. You know, they really know how to captivate and to have to place items to call your attention, to memorize. So when you are actually, the waiters comes and you're like still debating, you're going to memorize. What are you going to memorize? Not the middle item. You're probably going to most likely memorize the beginning and the end of that list. And then, of course, there's like subtle enhancements and visual affordances that you can make to even emphasize that. And of course, Amazon does that pretty well. A lot of the relevant information is actually above the fold, not in the middle, lost somewhere away as you scroll. A really interesting study was done a few years back that, this was a fascinating study, based on understanding the behavior of online shoppers, right? And what they did was that they just placed 4 camping tents, as you see. You know, somehow similar, but still, you know, with a few different features here and there. The first one, and this is actually interesting, they actually swapped the order many times in this horizontal row of 4 choices. They swapped the order a few times, and then always the first one got 2.5 times more clicks than any other, regardless of whether it was a red one, the pink, or whatnot. Fascinating, right? So think about this. Also, not just things that users need to click, but also even information that you display. If you are highlighting the great features of your product, or the mission statements, or the values of your company, that first value is likely the one to be more memorable for your audience. And I love this quote pertaining to this principle. There is no expedient to which a man will not resort to avoid the real labor of thinking, which is, again, really a bias that we all share and that has helped us immensely getting this far. This is my final principle and my all-time favorite. It's called the Flexibility-Usability Tradeoff, and I wish more people would really truly embrace the importance of this specific principle. It basically says that as the flexibility of a system increases, the usability of a system decreases, right? So think about TV remotes. Remember, like maybe 20 years ago, you had a really basic TV remote. I mean, from a flexibility standpoint, it was pretty weak. There was not that much you could do with it. Turn it on and off, change the channel, and change the volume. That's it. Now, from a usability standpoint, it was pretty high, right? You know, anyone could do it. There's no way you can miss it. Large buttons, etc. Now, as we move towards many of the TV remotes that you have, some at home or in a hotel room, it looks more like this, right? So again, from a flexibility standpoint, it's tremendously high, right? You could do anything really with this little thing. But then on a usability side, of course, it's problematic, right? And notice how designers have tried to sort of improve usability by assigning different colors, using different shapes, working with placement. But even then, it's not enough. There's just a tremendous load of stuff that does not need to be there. And again, think about the 80-20 rule. They are treating all of this as equally important when I'm sure they are not, right? I'm sure that, again, 80 to 90% of users probably just care about one small segment of that. So this is one of the most important principles, and I was actually at Nokia in London, working at Nokia when the iPhone came out. And I think Nokia is one of the famous cases for not truly understanding this principle, in the sense that they only cared about adding more features, to a point where most of these features were not even being used necessarily by their audience, but they just this need to continue growing, improving, adding more features. And I think all of us go through that process, right? I certainly have gone through many episodes where I'm faced in a meeting where people just are fighting for more features to be added. Why not? Because, maybe a small segment of the market needs this, right? And then all of a sudden you get to something like this, right? So it's a really important principle. So this is really kind of the end of my talk. If you are into some of these principles and maybe even other cognitive biases and understanding the human brain, this is arguably my favorite Wikipedia page. I know it sounds a little bit geeky, but it is my favorite Wikipedia page because there's so much to learn and unpack about the human brain, about human behavior. It's remarkable. So if you haven't visited this page, it's called the List of Cognitive Biases. I really encourage you to do so. Again, there's so many you can learn. And what I also like about this is that many of these biases are shared by all of us, right? In Canada, in the US, in Portugal, in many other places. These are truly human universals. And I think specifically in a time where we keep highlighting our differences so much, right? I find it a lot more evocative to concentrate on our similarities, on the things that we are connected, on what makes us all human beings. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Manuel Lima, mesdames et messieurs, Manuel Lima, on l'applaudit bien fort. Wow. Manuel, reste avec nous parce que maintenant, mesdames et messieurs, on a l'occasion de poser des questions à Manuel via l'application sleep.do. Alors, ce que je vous demande de faire, c'est d'aller avec votre furteur mobile, aller sur la page sli.do. Le code de la conférence est UXC19 et vous allez voir apparaître la page sur laquelle vous pouvez poser des questions. But Manuel,
oui?
Manuel, don't go.
Yeah,
don't
no,
go.
I'm going to stay. Because I forget about this. It happens all the time.
We want more of you.
Of course.
You've teased us with a number of fascinating principles, of many of which we recognize ourselves in, like
Sure.
This page of 200 cognitive bias. I see myself in there. It's unbelievable how imperfect we are. How do you design taking into account such biases, such cognitive biases? Give us an example of that, of how you do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think they come into place. So one of the myths that I'm trying to deconstruct is whenever I'm faced with a design critique or like a review, right? And this is either as a manager or as a designer myself, one of the things that I want to fight against is arguments like, oh, I think this experience works better because I talked to, my friend and they really liked it, because I think I really like orange, so why not? And I think it's much more appealing this way. So these are arguments that if it's hard for fellow designers to swallow, it's even harder for non-designers to swallow, right? And I think if anything, they do a disservice to design, right? I think if you really want to sell your idea, if you really want to convince others that this is the right solution for the problem, you need to really be effective at persuading others. And persuasion, we could talk about persuasion endlessly, but one of the critical areas in my view is arming yourself with weapons, and weapons being evidence as to why this is a more effective design solution than, let's say, A, B, C. There's arguably two ways you can do that, and I went through them. One is user research, right? Rely on user research, right? Come with that evidence. Say, hey, I tested this with a given sample, and this is the result, User research is critical. But if you don't have that, because sometimes we don't have user research at our disposal, right? I've worked with many startups that they don't have, they have one single designer, right? They don't even have the time, or it's really hard for them to actually apply research. So I think cognitive design, memorize a lot of these principles. And then when you go in and say, I've decided that this solution is the best because given this principle, given this solid empirical research on this area, this is arguably the best solutions, right? So arming yourselves with evidence, either through users or through demonstrated cognitive principles, right?
And those
can be dramatic.
The design principle you thought are evidence-based, so you do have
Absolutely.
Backing for
Yeah.
arguing for them. There's one question from the
Yeah,
audience.
and that's an important look. That's an important thing because these principles are not just made up. These are based on, again, on a various amount of research, on seminal papers, and et cetera, et cetera. So, and of course, if you recognize them, it's because they have been with us for so long, right? And they've been proven to be right on and on, right? So this is not just like completely made up. So again, arming yourself with evidence, I think it's tremendous.
As opposed to arguing on the sake of you're the expert and you're the designer, so
Correct.
you know better.
Correct. So when I teach, when I talk about some of these things, and we were talking about this yesterday at dinner, I think I get more of a positive reaction from non-designers. Because for the first time, engineers, let's say, they look at this and say, wow, I finally understand many of the design options that I've seen in the past. Because before, no one actually bothered to explain to them the secrets behind good design, right? Why design can be effective.
So engineers are like this very rational approach to design, which is fact-based and there's a science to it as opposed to, black magic.
Exactly, black magic, subjectiveness.
Yeah. Well, talking about engineers, like that's one question from the audience. You alluded to fighting for usability versus adding one more feature. This creep of complexity of the interface and the like, and how you are often caught into arguing, and we all relate to that because this is a typical situation. You argue with the engineers who see it their way. You argue with the product manager who sees it the other way, and the business imperatives, and this and that, and you end up with a massively complex set of requirements that's just impossible. How do you convince them? What do you tell them to prevail? Yeah,
that's tough. That's really hard because when you are working in a large business, unfortunately, it's not just the user that really is the ultimate voice, as it should. Sometimes there's also like business goals, business targets that they have to hit, and there's multiple factors of that nature. Without mentioning, the normal political rivalries and all that stuff that we are very acquainted to. So it's quite a challenge. I mean, I think but I will always go back to the user. I will always go back, even when you are faced and you have a tremendous argument, let's say with your PM, that they want to have 3 more features added, and they think that's critical. And then you can say, okay, so let's test this. Let's put this in front of some users, and let's see what the outcome is, right? Really try to, again, arm yourselves with that. Don't fall into the trap of just debating, be like an argument from authority, which is, I'm a designer, so I know best what should be done in that space. So go back to the user, try to find other evidence. And this is actually a common question that I ask when interviewing designers at Google and in other places is, how do you know that the design solution you created is the right one, right? And I think that's, if they fail that question, I think it's an immediate cross, which is, again, goes back to the user, right? You cannot say the wrong answer would be, oh, because I really liked it, I thought it was pretty cool. All right. So I think, again, arming yourselves with evidence, be smart about how you defend yourselves. And again, going back to persuasion and selling your idea, sometimes we forget that selling your idea is sometimes even more important than your idea, right? No matter how great it is. And even persuasion, to your point about engineers enjoying this so much, if you are to persuade this, and this could be a client, this could be a stakeholder, this could be your manager, really connect with them. Right? Understand, again, empathy. Build empathy with that person. That person is a fellow human being. They are probably driven by other metrics than you are. Maybe you care passionate about the users, but they are equally as passionate about growing the business in some other way, right? So connect to them at that level. Understand what matters to them, so then you can actually build a bridge and be able to persuade about your idea much more effectively, right?
Another question we have from the audience is, I mean, there's like 20 questions, so we're just gonna go for a couple more.
It's gonna be a long coffee break.
you're gonna have a very busy lunchtime here.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Perfect.
Like in thinking of e-commerce websites, like we've seen the rise and ascension of like migrating to the online world for e-commerce and purchases and the like. But in today's 2019 context, what would be the 2 or 3 top attributes of the most successful e-commerce websites from your informed point of view?
Well, that's true. I mean, I think convenience is hands down the most paramount. It's not even price anymore. It's
Convenience,
just convenience.
D'être pratique, so that it's...
Yeah, absolutely, the convenience. And I think that's why Amazon has been so successful, is thinking about not just doing a great website, but thinking about the experience in a holistic way, right? And the convenience from like the time of shipment, investing in warehouses really close to your home so that they can actually come much faster, right? Returns make it super easy to do, right? If you think about Amazon, it's not the website, it's tremendously amazing. It's the whole ecosystem of experiences that they have decreased, and they really put, I mean, talk about a company that really puts the user up front, right?
It's a fascinating example, because this is one example where you point out that the website might actually not even be best practice according to your principles.
Absolutely. I mean, yes. I mean, they do a few smart things here and there. Absolutely. You know, like things like one-click button, all that stuff. But it's not
the overall experience.
It's the overall experience, right? And why do you go? And this has, I'm sure, happened to many of you. Like, go somewhere where maybe there's an item that is not on Amazon, surprisingly, and then you want to buy through their website, and then you realize it takes 2 weeks to get to you, or then you get it and you cannot return it. So like all of those impediments make you not come back, right? And then as a user, you need to think about the experience in a holistic way. It's not just about the website is so great because this button is so well designed. It's the whole experience, right? So Amazon has been so successful because of it.
Should we go for, Manuel, we'd love to know more. Please stay with us. Please come and have coffees and lunches and dinners and spend the evening with us. So a big round of applause for Manuel Lima. Thank you so much.